as if he expected her to strike him. You know me, she said. You feel me. She took hold of his arm and pulled it up toward her. He didn't have time to make a fist. She laid his palm on her stomach. You think you disgust me, Boone? You think you horrify me? You don't. She drew his hand up toward her breasts. I still want you, Boone. Midian wants you too, but I want you more. I want you cold, if that's the way you are. I want you dead, if that's the way you are. And I'll come to you if you won't come to me. I'll let them shoot me down. No, he said. Her grip on his hand was light now. He could have slipped it, but he chose to leave his touch upon her, with only the thin fabric of her blouse intervening. She wished she could dissolve it at will, have his hand stroking the skin between her breasts. They're going to come for us sooner or later, she said. Nor was she bluffing. There were voices from outside, a lynch mob gathering. Maybe the monsters were forever, but so were their persecutors. They'll destroy us both, Boone. You for what you are, me for loving you. And I'll never hold you again. I don't want that, Boone. I don't want us dust in the same wind. I want us flesh. Her tongue had outstripped her intention. She hadn't meant to say it so plainly, but it was said now, and true. She wasn't ashamed of it. I won't let you deny me, Boone, she told him. The words were their own engine. They drove her hand to Boone's cold scalp. She snatched a fist of his hair. He didn't resist her. Instead, the hand on her chest closed on the blouse, and he went down onto his knees in front of her, pressing his face to her crotch, licking at it as if to tongue her clean of clothes and enter her with spit and spirit. Yourself. He looked up from his pleasure. Chapter 22. Triumph of the Mass. 1. If he never saw another day like today, Eigerman thought, he'd have little to complain about to the Lord when he was eventually called. First, the sight of Boone in chains. Then bringing the baby out to meet the cameras, knowing his face would be on the cover of every newspaper in the country tomorrow morning. And now this, the glorious sight of Midian notion and the damned good to pour lighted gasoline down the gullets of the tombs, to drive whatever was underground up into the light. It had worked better than either of them had anticipated. Once the smoke began to thicken and the fires to spread, the enemy had no choice but to exit their cesspit into the open air, where God's good sun took many of them apart at a stroke. Not all, however. Some of them had time to prepare for their emergence, protecting themselves against the light by whatever desperate means they could. Their invention was in vain. The pyre was sealed, gates guarded, walls manned. Unable to escape skyward with wings and heads covered against the sun, they were driven back into the conflagration. In other circumstances, Eigerman might not have allowed himself to enjoy the spectacle as openly as he did. But these creatures weren't human. That much was apparent even from a safe distance. They were miscreated fuckheads, no two the same. And he was sure the saints themselves would have laughed to see them bested. Putting down the devil was the Lord's own sport. But it couldn't last forever. Night would soon be falling. When it did, their strongest defense against the enemy would drop out of sight and the tide might turn. They'd have to leave the bonfire to burn overnight and return at dawn to dig the survivors out of their niches and finish them off. With crosses and holy water securing the walls and gates, there'd be little chance of any escaping before daybreak. He wasn't sure what power was working to subdue the monsters. Daylight, fate, all or some combination of these. It didn't matter. All that concerned him was that he had the power to crack their heads. A shout from down the hall broke Eigerman's train of thought. You've got to stop this! It was Ashbury. It looked as though he'd been standing close to the flames. His face was half-cooked, basted in sweat. "Stop what?" Eigerman yelled back. "This massacre." "I see no massacre." Ashbury was within a couple of yards of Eigerman, but he still had to shout over the noise from below. The din of the freaks and the fires punctuated now and again by louder dins as the heat broke a slab or brought a mausoleum down. "They don't stand a chance," Ashbury hollered. "They're not supposed to," Eigerman pointed out. "But you don't know who's down there. Eigerman, you don't know who you're killing." The chief grinned. "I know damn well," he said, a look in his eyes that Ashbury had only ever seen in mad dogs. "I'm killing the dead, and how can that be wrong? Hey, answer me, Ashbury. How can it be wrong to make the dead lie down and stay dead?" "There's children down there, Eigerman," Ashbury replied, jabbing a finger in the direction of Midian. "Oh, yes, with eyes like headlights, and teeth. You seen the teeth on those fuckers? That's the devil's children, Ashbury. You're out of your mind. You haven't got the balls to believe that, have you? You haven't got balls at all." He took a step toward the priest and caught hold of the black castle. "Maybe you're more like them than us," he said. "Is that what it is, Ashbury? Feel the call of the wild, do you?" Ashbury rescued his robes from Eigerman's grip. They tore. "All right," he said. "I tried reasoning with you. If you've got such God-fearing executioners, then maybe a man of God can stop them." "You leave my men alone," Eigerman said. But Ashbury was already halfway down the hill, his voice carried above the tumult. "Stop!" he yelled. "Lay down your weapons!" Center stage in front of the main gates, he was visible to a good number of Eigerman's army, and though few, if any, had stepped into a church since their wedding or their baptism, they listened now. They wanted some explanation of the sights the last hour had provided, sights they'd happily have fled from, but that some urge they barely recognized as their own kept them at the wall, childhood prayers on their lips. Eigerman knew their loyalty was only his by default. They didn't obey him because they loved the law. They obeyed because they were more afraid of retreating in front of their companions than of doing the job. They obeyed because they couldn't defy the ant under the magnifying fascination of watching helpless things go bad. They obeyed because obeying was simpler than not. Ashbury might change their minds. He had the robes, he had the record. If he wasn't stopped, he might still spoil the day.
You okay,
Eigerman took his gun from his holster and followed the priest down the hill. Ashbury saw him coming, saw that.
Give me 1 second.
He raised his voice still louder. "This isn't what God wants," he yelled. "And it's not what you want either. You don't want innocent blood on your hands." Priest at the bitter end, I thought, laying on the heel. "Shut your mouth, faggot," he hollered. Ashbury had no intention of doing so. "They're not animals in there. They're people, and you're killing them just because this lunatic tells you to." His words carried weight, even among the atheists. He was voicing a doubt more than one had entertained, but none had dared express. Half a dozen non-uniforms began to retire toward their cars, all enthusiasm for the extermination of brains. One of Eigerman's men also withdrew from his station at the gate, his slow retreat becoming a run as the chief fired a shot in his direction. "Stand your ground," he bellowed, but the man was away, lost in the smoke. Eigerman turned his fury back on Ashbury. "Got some bad news," he said, advancing toward the priest. Ashbury looked to right and left for someone willing to defend him, but nobody moved. "You're going to watch him kill me?" he appealed. "For God's sake, won't somebody help me?" Eigerman leveled his gun. Ashbury had no intention of attempting to outrun the bullet. He dropped to his knees. "Our Father," he began. "You're on your own, cuz." Eigerman heard. "Nobody's listening." "Not true," somebody said. "Huh?" The prayer faltered. "I'm listening." Eigerman turned his back on the priest. A figure loomed in the smoke. He pointed the gun in the other's direction. Who are you? Sun's almost set, the other said. One more step and I'll shoot you. So shoot, said the man, and took a step toward the gun. The tatters of smoke that clung to him blew away, and the prisoner in cell 5 walked into Eigerman's sights. His skin bright, his eyes brighter. He was stark naked. There was a bullet hole in the middle of his chest, and more wounds besides, decorating his body. Dead, Eigerman said. You bet. Jesus Lord. He backed off a step and another. 10 minutes, maybe, before sundown, Boone said. Then the world's ours. Eigerman shook his head. Not getting me, he said. I won't let you get me. His backward steps multiplied, and suddenly he was away at speed, not looking behind him. Had he done so, he would have seen that Boone was not interested in pursuit. He was moving instead toward the besieged gates of Midian. Ashbury was still on the ground. Get up. If you're going to kill me, do it, will you? Ashbury said. Get it over with. Why should I kill you? He said. I'm a priest. So, you're a monster. And you are not. Ashbury looked up. Me? There's lace under the robe, he said. Ashbury pulled together the tear in his cassock. Why hide it? Let me alone. Forgive yourself, Boone said. I did. He walked on past Ashbury to the gates. Wait, the priest said. I'd get going if I were you. They don't like the robes in Midian. Bad memories. I want to see, Ashbury said. Why? Please, take me with you. It's your risk. I'll take it. 2. From a distance, it was hard to be sure what was going on down at the cemetery gates, but of 2 facts the doctor was sure. Boone had returned and somehow bested Eigerman. At the first sight of his arrival, Decker had taken shelter in one of the police vehicles. There he sat now, briefcase in hand, trying to plot his next action. It was difficult, with 2 voices each counseling different things. His public self demanded retreat before events became any more dangerous. Leave now, he said. Just drive away. Let them all die together. There was wisdom in this. With night almost fallen and Boone there to rally them, Midian's hosts might still triumph. If they did, and they found Decker, his heart would be ripped from his chest. But there was another voice demanding his attention. Stay, said the voice of the mask, rising from the case on his lap. You've denied me here once already, it said. So, knowing when there'd come a time for repaying the debt. Not now, he whispered. Now, it said. He knew rational argument carried no weight against his heart, nor did pleading. Use your eyes, it said. I've got work to do. What did it see that he didn't? He stared out through the window. Don't you see her? Now he did. In his fascination with Boone, naked at the gates, he'd missed the other newcomer to the field. Boone's woman. Do you see the bitch? The mask said. I see her. Perfect timing, eh? In this chaos, who's going to see me finish her off? Nobody. And with her gone, there'll be no one left who knows our secret. There's still Boone. He'll never testify, the mask. He's a dead man, for Christ's sake. What's a zombie's word worth? Tell me that. Nothing, Decker said. Exactly. He's no danger to us. But the woman is. Let me silence her. Suppose you're seen. Suppose I am, the mask said. They'll think I was one of Gideon's clan all along. Not you, Decker said. The thought of his precious other being confused with the degenerates of Midian nauseated him. You're pure, he said. Let me prove it, the mask. Just the woman. Just the woman. Then we'll leave. He knew the advice made sense. They'd never have a better opportunity for killing the bitch. He started to unlock the case. Inside, the mask grew agitated. Quickly, or we'll lose her. His fingers slid in the dial as he ran the numbers of the lock. Quickly, damn you! The final digit clicked into place. The lock sprang open. Old Buttonface was never more beautiful. 3. Though Boone had advised Laurie to stay with Narcissus, the sight of Midian in flames was enough to draw her companion away from the safety of the hill and down toward the cemetery gates. Laurie went with him a little way, but her presence seemed to intrude upon his grief, so she hung back a few paces, and in the smoke and deepening twilight was soon divided from him. The scene before her was one of utter confusion. Any attempt to complete the assault on the necropolis had ceased since Boone had sent Eigerman running. Both his men and their civilian support had retreated from around the walls. Some had already driven away, most likely fearing what would happen when the sun sank over the horizon. Most remained, however, prepared to beat a retreat if necessary, but mesmerized by the spectacle of destruction. Her gaze went from one to another, looking for some sign of what they were feeling, but every face was blank. They looked like masks, she thought, wiped of response, except that she knew the dead now. She walked with them, talked with them, saw them feel and weep. Who then were the real dead? The silent-hearted who still knew pain, or their glassy-eyed tormentors? A break in the smoke uncovered the sun, teetering on the rim of the world. The red light dazzled her. She closed her eyes against it. In the darkness, she heard a breath a little way behind her. She opened her eyes and began to turn, knowing harm was coming. Too late to slip it. The mask was a yard from her and closing. She had only seconds before the knife found her, but it was long enough to see the mask as she'd never seen it before. Here was the blankness on the faces she'd studied, perfectly perfected. The human fiend made myth. No use to call it Decker. It wasn't Decker. No use to call it anything. It was as far beyond names as she was beyond powers to tame it. It slashed her arm, once and again. There were no taunts from it this time. It had come only to dispatch her. The wound stung. Instinctively, she put her hand to them, her motion giving him opportunity to kick the legs from under her. She had no time to cushion her fall. The impact emptied her lungs. Sobbing for breath, she turned her face to the ground to keep it from the knife. The earth seemed to shudder beneath her. Illusion, surely. Yet it came again. She glanced up at the mask. He too had felt the tremors and was looking toward the cemetery. His distraction would be her only reprieve. She had to take it. Rolling out of his shadow, she got to her feet. There was no sign of Narcissus or Rachel, nor much hope of help from the death masks, who'd forsaken their vigil and were hurrying away from the smoke as the tremors intensified. Fixing her eyes on the gate through which Boone had stepped, she stumbled down the hill, the dusty soil dancing at her feet. The source of the agitation was Midian, its cue the disappearance of the sun, and with it the light that had trapped the breed underground. It was their noise that made the ground shake as they destroyed their refuge. What was below could remain below no longer. The Nightbreed were rising. The knowledge didn't persuade her from her course. Whatever was loose inside the gate, she'd long ago made her peace with it, and might have felt mercy. From the horror at her back, matching her stride to stride, she could expect none. There were only the fires from the tombs up ahead to light her way now, a way strewn with the debris of the siege. Gasoline cans, shovels, discarded weapons. She was almost at the gates before she caught sight of Babette, standing close to the wall, her face terror-stricken. "Run!" she yelled, afraid the mask would wound the child. Babette did as she was told, her body seeming to melt into beast as she turned and fled through the gates. Laurie came a few paces after her. But by the time she was over the threshold, the child had already gone, lost down the smoke-filled avenues. The tremors here were strong enough to unseat the paving stones and topple the mausoleums, as though some force underground, Baphomet perhaps, who made Midian, was shaking its foundations to bring the place to ruin. She hadn't anticipated such violence. Her chances of surviving the cataclysm were slim. But better to be buried in the rubble than succumb to the mass, and be flattered at the end that fate had at least offered her a choice of extinctions. Chapter 23. The Harrowing. 1. In the cell at Sheer Neck, memories of Midian's labyrinth had tormented Boone. Closing his eyes against the sun, he'd found himself lost here, only to open them again and find the maze echoed in the whorls of his fingertips and the veins on his arms. Veins in which no heat ran, reminders, like Midian, of his shame. Laurie had broken that spell of despair, coming to him not begging, but demanding he forgive himself. Now, back in the avenues from which his monstrous condition had sprung, he felt her love for him like the life his body no longer possessed. He needed its comfort in the pandemonium. The Nightbreed were not simply bringing Midian down. They were erasing all clue to their nature or keepsake of their passing. He saw them at work on every side, laboring to finish what Eigerman's scourge had begun, gathering up the pieces of their dead and throwing them into the flames, burning their beds, their clothes, anything they couldn't take with them. These were not the only preparations for escape. He glimpsed the breed in forms he'd never before had the honor to see, unfurling wings, unfolding limbs, one becoming many, a man, a flock, many becoming one, 3 lovers, a cloud. All around, the rites of departure. Ashbury was still at Boone's side, agog. Where are they going? I'm too late, Boone said. They're leaving Midian. The lid of a tomb ahead flew off, and a ghost form rose like a rocket into the night sky. Beautiful, Ashbury said. What are they? Why have I never known them? Boone shook his head. He had no way to describe the breed that were not the old ways. They didn't belong to hell, nor yet to heaven. They were what the species he'd once belonged to could not bear to be. The unpeople, the anti-tribe, humanity's sack unpicked and sewn together again with the moon inside. And now, before he'd had a chance to know them, and by knowing them, know himself, he was losing them. They were finding transport in their cells and rising to the night. Too late, he said again, the pain of this parting bringing tears to his eyes. The escapes were gathering momentum. On every side, doors were being thrown wide and slabs overturned as the spirits ascended in innumerable forms. Not all flew. Some went as goat or tiger, racing through the flames to the gate. Most went alone, but some, whose fecundity neither death nor Midian had slowed, went with families of 6 or more, their littlest in their arms. He was witnessing, he knew, the passing of an age, the end of which had begun the moment he'd first stepped on Midian's soil. He was the maker of this devastation, though he'd set no fire and toppled no tomb. He had brought men to Midian. In doing so, he'd destroyed it. Even Laurie could not persuade him to forgive himself that. The thought might have tempted him to the flames had he not heard the child calling his name. She was only human enough to use words. The rest was beast. Laurie, she said. What about her? The mask has her. The mask? She could only mean Decker. Where? 2. Close and closer still. Knowing she couldn't outpace him, she tried instead to outdare him, going where she hoped he would not. But he was too hot for her life to be shaken off. He followed her into territory where the ground erupted beneath their feet, and smoking stone rained around them. It was not his voice that called her, however. "Laurie, this way!" She chanced a desperate look, and there, God love him, was Narcissus beckoning. She veered off the pathway, or what was left of it, toward him, ducking between two mausoleums as their stained glass blew, and a stream of shadow, pricked with eyes, left its hiding place for the stars. It was like a piece of night sky itself, she marveled. It belonged in the heavens. The sight slowed her pace by an all but fatal step. The mask closed the gap between them and snatched at her blouse. She threw herself forward to avoid the stab she knew must follow, the fabric tearing as she fell. This time he had her. Even as she reached for the wall to haul herself to her feet, she felt his gloved hand at her nape. "Fuckhead!" somebody shouted. She looked up to see Narcissus at the other end of the passage between the mausoleums. He clearly caught Decker's attention. The hold on her neck was relaxing. It wasn't enough for her to squirm free, but if Narcissus could only keep up his distraction, he might do the trick. "Got something for you," he said, and took his hands from his pocket to display the silver hooks on his thumbs. He struck the hooks together. They sparked. Decker let Laurie's neck slip from his fingers. She slid out of his reach and began to stumble toward Narcissus. He was moving down the passage toward her, or rather toward Decker, on whom his eyes were fixed. "Don't," she gasped. "He's dangerous." Narcissus heard her. He grinned at the warning, but he made no reply. He just moved on past her to intercept the killer. Laurie glanced back. As the pair came within a yard of each other, the mask dragged a second knife, its blade as broad as a machete, from his jacket. Before Narcissus had a chance to defend himself, the butcher delivered a swift downward stroke that separated Narcissus's left hand from his wrist in a single cut. Shaking his head, Narcissus took a backward step, but the mask matched his retreat, raising the machete a second time and bringing it down on his victim's skull. The blow divided Narcissus's head from scalp to neck. It was a wound even a dead man could not survive. Narcissus's body began to shake, and then, like Onaka trapped in sunlight, he came apart with a crack, a chorus of howls and sighs emerging, then taking flight. Laurie let out a sob, but stifled anything more. There was no time to mourn. If she waited to shed a single tear, the mask would claim her, and Narcissus's sacrifice would have been for nothing. She started to back away, the walls shaking to either side of her, knowing she should simply run, but unable to detach herself from the sight of the mask's depravity. Rooting amid the carnage, he skewered half of Narcissus's head and the finer of his blades, then rested the knife on his shoulder, trophy and all, before renewing his pursuit. Now she ran out of the shadow of the mausoleums and back onto the main avenue. Even if memory could have offered a guide to her whereabouts, all the monuments had gone to the same rubble. She could not tell north from south. It was all one in the end. Whichever way she turned, the same ruin and the same pursuer. If he would come after her forever, and he would, what was the use of living in fear of him? Let him have his sharp way. Her heart beat too hard to be pressed any further. But even as she resigned herself to his knife, the stretch of paving between her and her slaughterer cracked open, a plume of smoke shielding her from the mass. An instant later, the whole avenue opened up. She fell, not to the ground. There was no ground, but into the earth. 3. "Falling," the child said. The shock of it almost toppled her from Boone's shoulders. His hands went up to support her. She took fiercer hold of his hair. "Steady," he said. "Yes." She wouldn't countenance Ashbury accompanying them. He'd been left to fend for himself in the maelstrom while they went looking for Laurie. "Ahead," she said, directing her mount. "Not very far." The fires were dying down, having devoured all they could get their tongues to. Confronted with cold brick, all they could do was lick it black, then gutter out. But the tremors from below had not ceased. Their motion still ground stone on stone. And beneath the reverberations there was another sound, which Boone didn't so much hear as feel, in his gut and balls and teeth. The child turned his head with her reins. "That way," she said. The diminishing fires made progress easier. Their brightness hadn't suited Boone's eyes. Now he went more quickly, though the avenues had been plowed by the quake, and he trod turned earth. "How far?" he asked. "Hush," she told him. "What?" "Stand still." "You hear it too?" he said. "Yes." "What is it?" She didn't answer at first, but listened again. Then she said, "Baphomet." In his hours of imprisonment, he'd thought more than once of the baptizer's chamber, of the cold time he'd spent witness to the divided God. Hadn't it spoken prophecies to him, whispered in his head and demanded he listen? It had seen this ruin. It had told him Midian's last hour was imminent. Yet there'd been no accusations, though it must have known that it spoke to the man responsible. Instead, it had seemed almost intimate, which had terrified him more than any assault. He could not be the confidant of divinities. He'd come to appeal to Baphomet as one of the newly dead requesting a place in the earth. But he'd been greeted like an actor in some future drama, called by another name even. He'd wanted none of it. Not the auguries, not the name. He'd fought them, turning his back on the baptizer, stumbling away, shaking the whispers from his head. In that he'd not succeeded. At the thought of Baphomet's presence, its words and that name were back like furies. "Your Cabal," it had said. He denied it then. He denied it now. Much as he pitied Baphomet's tragedy, knowing it couldn't escape this destruction in its wounded condition, he had more urgent claims upon his sympathies. He couldn't save the baptizer, but he could save Lori. "She's there," the child said. "Which way?" "Straight ahead. Look." There was only chaos visible. The avenue in front of them had been split open. Light and smoke poured up through the ruptured ground. There was no sign of anything living. "I don't see her," he said. "She's underground," the child replied. "In the pit." "Direct me then." "I can't go any farther." "Why not?" "Put me down. I've taken you as far as I can." A barely suppressed panic had crept into her voice. "Put me down," she insisted. Boone dropped to his haunches, and the child slid off his shoulders. "What's wrong?" he said. "I mustn't go with you. It's not allowed." After the havoc they'd come through, her distress was bewildering. "What are you afraid of?" he said. "I can't look," she replied. "Not at the baptizer." "It's here?" She nodded, retreating from him as new violence opened the fissure ahead even wider. "Go to Lori," she told him. "Bring her out. You're all she has." Then she was gone, two legs becoming four as she fled, leaving Boone to the pit. 4. Lori's consciousness flickered out. When she came round seconds later, she was lying halfway up or down a steep slope. The roof above her was still intact, but badly fractured, the cracks opening even as she watched, presaging total collapse. If she didn't move quickly, she'd be buried alive. She looked toward the head of the slope. The cross tunnel was open to the sky. She began to crawl toward it, earth cascading down on her head, the walls creaking as if they were pressed to surrender. "Not yet," she murmured. "Please, not yet." It was only as she came within 6 feet of the summit that her dazed senses recognized the slope. She'd carried Boone up this very incline once, away from the power that resided in the chamber at the bottom. Was it still there, watching her scrabblings? Or was this whole cataclysm evidence of its departure, the architect's farewell? She couldn't feel its surveillance, but then she could feel very little. Her body and mind functioned because instinct told them to. There was life at the top of the slope, inch by racking inch. She was crawling to meet it. Another minute and she reached the tunnel, or its roofless remains. She lay on her back for a time, staring up at the sky. With her breath regained, she got to her feet and examined her wounded arm. The cuts were gummed up with dirt, but at least the blood had ceased to flow. As she coaxed her legs to move, something fell in front of her, wet in the dirt. Narcissus looked up at her with half a face. She sobbed his name, turning her eyes to meet the mask. He straddled the tunnel like a gravedigger, then dropped down to join her. The spike was aimed at her heart. Had she been stronger, it would have struck home. But the earth at the head of the slope gave way beneath her backward step, and she had no power to keep herself from falling, head over heels, back down the incline. Her cry gave Boone direction. He clambered over upended slabs of paving into the exposed tunnels, then through the maze of toppled walls and dying fires toward her. It was not her figure he saw in the passage ahead, however, turning to meet him with knives at the ready. It was the doctor, at last. From the precarious safety of the slope, Laurie saw the mask turn from her, diverted from its purpose. She had managed to arrest her fall by catching hold of a crack in the wall with her good hand, which did its duty long enough for her to glimpse Boone in the passageway above. She'd seen what the machete had done to Narcissus. Even the dead had their mortality. But before she could utter any word of warning to Boone, a wave of cold power mounted the slope behind her. Baphomet had not vacated its flame. It was there still, its grasp unpicking her fingers from the wall. Unable to resist it, she slid backward down the slope into the erupting chamber. The ecstasies of the breed hadn't tainted Decker. He came at Boone like an abattoir worker to finish a slaughter he'd been called from, without flourish, without passion. He struck quickly, with no signal of his intention. The thin blade ran straight through Boone's neck. To disarm the enemy, Boone simply stepped away from him. The knife slid through Decker's fingers, still caught in Boone's flesh. The doctor made no attempt to claim it back. Instead, he took a two-handed grip on the skull splitter. Now there was some sound from him, a low moan that broke into gasps as he threw himself forward to dispatch his victim. Boone ducked the slicing blow, and the blade embedded itself in the tunnel wall. Earth spattered them both as Decker pulled it free. Then he swung again, this time missing his target's face by a finger length. Caught off balance, Boone almost fell, and his downcast eyes chanced on Decker's trophy. He couldn't mistake that maimed face. Narcissus, cut up and dead in the dirt. "You bastard!" he roared. Decker paused for a moment and watched Boone. Then he spoke, not with his own voice, but with someone else's, a grinning whine of a voice. "You can die," it said. As he spoke, he swung the blade back and forth, not attempting to touch Boone, merely to demonstrate his authority. The blade whined like the voice, the music of a fly in a coffin, to and fro between the walls. Boone retreated before the display with mortal terror in his gut. Decker was right. The dead could die. He drew breath through mouth and punctured throat. He'd made a near-fatal error, staying human in the presence of the mask. And why? From some absurd idea that this final confrontation should be man to man, that they'd trade words as they fought, and he'd undo the doctor's ego before he undid his life. It wouldn't be that way. This wasn't a patient's revenge on his corrupted healer. This was a beast and a butcher, tooth to knife. He exhaled. and the truth in his cells came forth like honey. His nerves ran with bliss. His body throbbed as it swelled. In life, he'd never felt so alive as he did at these moments, stripping off his humanity and dressing for the night. "No more," he said, "and let the beast come from him everywhere." Decker raised his machete to undo the enemy before the change had been completed. But Boone didn't wait. Still transforming, he tore at the butcher's face, taking off the mask, buttons, zipper, and all, to uncover the infirmities beneath. Decker howled at being revealed, putting his hand up to his face to half cover it against the beast's stare. Boone snatched the mask up from the ground and began to tear it apart, his claws shredding the linen. Decker's howls mounted. Dropping his hand from his face, he began to swipe at Boone with insane abandon. The blade caught Boone's chest, slicing it open. But as it returned for a second cut, Boone dropped the rags and blocked the blow, carrying Decker's arm against the wall with such force he broke the bones. The machete fell to the ground, and Boone reached out for Decker's face. The steep howl stopped as the claws came at him. The mouth closed, the features slackened. For an instant, Boone was looking at a face he'd studied for hours, hanging on its every word. At that thought, his hand went from face to neck, and he seized Decker's windpipe, which had funded so many lies. He closed his fist, his claws piercing the meat of Decker's throat. Then he pulled. The machinery came out in a wash of blood. Decker's eyes widened, fixed on his silencer. Boone pulled again and again. The eyes glazed, the body jerked and jerked, then started to sag. Boone didn't let it drop. He held it as in a dance and undid the flesh and bone as he'd undone the mask. Clots of Decker's body striking the walls. There was only the dimmest memory of Decker's crimes against him in his head now. He tore with a breed's zeal, taking monstrous satisfaction in a monstrous act. When he'd done his worst, he dropped the wreckage to the earth and finished the dance with his partner underfoot. There'd be no rising from the grave for this body, no hope of earthly resurrection. Even in the full flood of his attack, Boone had withheld the bite that would have passed life after death into Decker's system. His flesh belonged only to the flies and their children. His reputation to the vagaries of those who chose to tell his story. Boone didn't care. If he never shrugged off the crimes Decker had hung around his neck, it scarcely mattered now. He was no longer innocent. With this slaughter, he became the killer Decker had persuaded him he was. In murdering the prophet, he made the prophecy true. He let the body lie and went to seek more. There was only one place she could have gone, down the slope into Baphomet's chamber. There was pattern in this, he saw. The baptizer had brought her here, unknitting the ground beneath her feet so as to bring Boone after. The flame its divided body occupied threw a cold glamour up into his face. He started down the slope toward him, dressed in the blood of his enemy. Chapter 24. Cabal. 1. Lost in the wasteland, Ashbury was found by a light flickering up from between the fractured paving stones. Its beams were bitterly cold and sticky in a way light had no right to be, adhering to his sleeve and hand before fading away. Intrigued, he tracked its source from one eruption to another, each point brighter than the one before. A scholar in his youth, he would have known the name Baphomet had someone whispered it to him, and understood why the light, springing from the deity's flame, exercised such a claim upon him. He would have known the deity as god and goddess in one body, would have known, too, how its worshippers had suffered for their idol, burned as heretics, or for crimes against nature. He might have feared a power that demanded such homage, and wisely. But there was nobody to tell him. There was only the light drawing him on. 2. The baptizer was not alone in its chamber, Boone found. He counted 11 members of the breed around the walls, kneeling blindfolded with their backs to the flame. Among them, Lylesburg and Rachel. On the ground to the right of the door lay Laurie. There was blood on her arm and on her face, and her eyes were closed. But even as he went to her aid, the thing in the flame set its eyes on him, turning him round with an icy touch. It had business with him, which it was not about to postpone. Approach, it said, of your own free will. He was afraid. The flame from the ground was twice the size it had been when last he'd entered, battering the roof of the chamber. Fragments of earth, turned to either ice or ash, fell in a glittering rain and littered the floor. A dozen yards from the flame, the assault of its energies was brutal, yet Baphomet invited him closer. You're safe, it said. You come in the blood of your enemy. It'll keep you warm. He took a step toward the fire. Though he'd suffered bullet and blade in his life since death, and felt none of them, he felt the chill from Baphomet's flame plainly enough. It pricked his nakedness, made frost patterns on his eyes. But Baphomet's words were no empty promise. The blood he wore grew hot as the air around him grew colder. He took comfort from it and braved the last few steps. The weapon, Baphomet said, discarded. He'd forgotten the knife in his neck. He drew it out of his flesh and threw it aside. Closer still, the baptizer said. The flame's fury concealed all but glimpses of its freight, but enough to confirm what his first encounter with Baphomet had taught him. That if this deity had made creatures in its own image, then he'd never set eyes on them. Even in dreams, nothing that approached the baptizer. It was one of one. Suddenly, some part of it reached for him out of the flame. Whether limb or organ or both, he had no chance to see. It snatched at his neck and hair and pulled him toward the fire. Decker's blood didn't shield him now. The ice scorched his face. Yet there was no fighting free. It immersed his head in the flame, holding him fast. He knew what this was the instant the fire closed around his head. Baptism. And to confirm that belief, Baphomet's voice in his head. You are Cabal, it said. The pain was mellowing. Boone opened his mouth to draw breath, and the fire coursed down his throat and into his belly and lungs, then through his whole system. It carried his new name with it, baptizing him inside out. He was no longer Boone. He was Cabal, an alliance of many. From this cleansing on, he would be capable of heat and blood and making children. That was in Baphomet's gift, and the deity gave it. But he would be frail, too, or frailer, not just because he bled, but because he was charged with purpose. I must be hidden tonight, Baphomet said. We all have enemies, but mine have lived longer and learned more cruelty than most. I will be taken from here and hidden from them. Now the actions of the breed made sense. They'd remained behind to take a fraction of the baptizer with them and conceal it from whatever forces came in pursuit. This is your doing, Cabal, Baphomet said. I don't accuse you. It was bound to happen. No refuge is forever. But I charge you. Yes, he said. Tell me. Rebuild what you've destroyed. A new Midian? No. What then? You must discover for us in the human world. Help me, he said. I can. From here on, it's you must help me. You've undone the world. Now you must remake it. There were shudders in the flame. The rites of baptism were almost over. How do I begin? Cabal said. Heal me, Baphomet replied. Find me and heal me. Save me from my enemies. The voice that had first addressed him had changed its nature utterly. All trace of demand had gone from it. There was only this prayer to be healed and kept from harm, delivered softly at his ear. Even the leash on his head had been slipped, leaving him free to look left and right. A call he hadn't heard had summoned Baphomet's attendants from the wall. Despite their blindfolds, they walked with steady steps to the edge of the flame, which had lost much of its ferocity. They'd raised their arms, over which shrouds were draped, and the flame wall broke as pieces of Baphomet's body were dropped into the traveler's waiting arms, to be wrapped up instantly and put from sight. This parting of piece from piece was agonizing. Cabal felt the pain as his own, filling him up until it was almost beyond enduring. To escape it, he began to retreat from the flame. But as he did so, the one piece yet to be claimed tumbled into view in front of his face. Baphomet's head. It turned to him, vast and white, its symmetry fabulous. His entire body rose to it, gaze, spittle, and prick. His heart began to beat, healing its damaged wing with its first throb. His congealed blood liquefied like a saint's relic and began to run. His testicles tightened. Sperm ran up his cock. He ejaculated into the flame, pearls of semen carried up past his eyes to touch the baptizer's face. Then the rendezvous was over. He stumbled out of the fire as Lylesburg, the last of the attendants in the chamber, received the head from the flames and at the aftertaste of Baphomet that flew beyond repair. Below, Cabal shook himself from the daze of revelation. The fire had blown a hole in the roof of the chamber and was spreading from it in all directions. It would consume flesh as easily as earth or stone. They had to be out of here before it found them. Glory was awake. From the suspicion in her eyes as he approached, it was plain she'd seen the baptism and feared him. It's me, he told her. It's still me. He offered her a hand. She took it and he pulled her to her feet. I'll carry you, he said. She shook her head. Her eyes had gone from him to something on the floor behind him. He followed her gaze. Decker's blade lay close to the fissure, where the man he'd been before the baptism had cast it aside. You want it? He said. Yes. Shielding his head from the debris, he retraced his steps and picked it up. Is he dead? She asked as he came back to her. He's dead. There was no sign of the corpse to verify his claim. The tunnel, collapsing on it, had already buried him as it was burying all of Midian, a tomb for the tombs. With so much already leveled, it wasn't difficult to find their way out to the main gates. They saw no sign of Midian's inhabitants on their way. Either the fire had consumed their remains, or rubble and earth covered them. Just outside the gate, left where they could not fail to find him, was a reminder for Lori of one whom she prayed had escaped unharmed. Babette's doll, woven from grasses and crowned with spring flowers, lay in a small ring of stones. As Laurie's fingers made contact with the toy, it seemed she saw one final time through the child's eyes, a landscape moving by as somebody speeded her away to safety. The glimpse was all too brief. She had no time to pass a prayer for good fortune along to the child before the vision was startled from her by a noise at her back. She turned to see that the pillars that had supported Midian's gates were beginning to topple. Boone snatched her arm as the two stone slabs struck each other, teetered head to head like matched wrestlers, then fell sideways to hit the ground where moments before Laurie and Boone had stood. 3. Though he had no watch to read the hour, Boone had a clear sense, Baphomet's gift, perhaps, of how long they had until daybreak. In his mind's eye, he could see the planet, a clock face decorated with seas, the magical divide of night from day creeping around it. He had no fear of the sun's appearance on the horizon. His baptism had given him a strength denied his brothers and sisters. The sun wouldn't kill him. This he knew without question. Undoubtedly, it would be a discomfort to him. Moonrise would always be a more welcome sight than daybreak. But his work wouldn't be confined to the night hours. He wouldn't need to hide his head from the sun the way his fellow breed were obliged to. Even now, they'd be looking for a place of refuge before morning broke. He imagined them in the sky over America, or running beside its highways, groups dividing when some among them grew tired or found a likely haven, the rest moving on, more desperate by the moment. Silently, he wished them safe journeys and secure harbor. More, he promised he would find them again with time, gather them up and unite them as Midian had done. Unwittingly, he'd harmed them. Now he had to heal that harm, however long it took. I have to start tonight, he told Laurie, or their trails will be cold. Then I'll never find them. You're not going without me, Boone. I'm not Boone any longer, he told her. Why? They sat on the hill overlooking the necropolis, and he recited to her all he'd learned at the baptism. Hard lessons, which he had too few words to communicate. She was weary and shivering, but she wouldn't let him stop. Go on, she'd kept saying when he'd faltered. Tell me everything. She knew most of it. She'd been Baphomet's instrument as much as he, or more, part of the prophecy. Without her, he'd never have returned to Midian to save it, and to fail. The consequence of that return and that failure was the task before him. Yet she revolted. You can't leave me, she said. Not after all that's happened. She put her hand on his leg. Remember the cell, she murmured. He looked at her. You told me to forgive myself. And it was good advice. But it doesn't mean I can turn my back on what happened here. Baphomet, Lylesburg, all of them. I destroyed the only home they ever had. You didn't destroy it. If I'd never come here, it'd still be standing, he replied. I have to undo that damage. So take me with you, she said. We'll go together. It can't be that way. You're alive, Laurie. I'm not. You're still human. I'm not. You can change that. What are you saying? You can make me the same as you. It's not difficult. One bite and Peloquin changed you forever. So change me. I can't. You won't, you mean? She turned the point of Decker's blade in the dirt. You don't want to be with me. Simple as that, isn't it? She made a small, tight-lipped smile. Haven't you got the guts to say it? When I've finished my work, he answered. Maybe then. Oh, in 100 years or so? She murmured, tears beginning. You'll come back for me then, will you? Dig me up, kiss me all over, tell me you would have come sooner, but the days just kept slipping by. Laurie, shut up, she said. Don't give me any more excuses. They're just insults. She studied the blade, not him. You've got your reasons. I think they stink, but you keep hold of them. You're going to need something to cling to. He didn't move. What are you waiting for? I'm not going to tell you it's all right. Just go. I never want to set eyes on you again. He stood up. Her anger hurt, but it was easier than tears. He backed away 3 or 4 paces. Then, understanding that she wouldn't grant him a smile or even a look, he turned from her. Only then did she glance up. His eyes were averted. It was now or never. She put the point of Decker's blade to her belly. She knew she couldn't drive it home with only one hand, so she went onto her knees, wedged the handle into the dirt, and let her body weight carry her down onto the blade. It hurt horribly. She yelled in pain. He turned to find her writhing, her good blood pouring out into the soil. He ran back to her, turning her over. The death spasms were already in her. I lied, she murmured. Boone, I lied. You're all I ever want to see. Don't die, he said. Oh, God in heaven, don't die. So stop me. I don't know how. Kill me. Bite me. Give me the balm. Pain twisted up her face. She gasped. Or let me die, if you can't take me with you. That's better than living without you. He cradled her, tears dropping onto her face. Her pupils were turning up beneath her lids. Her tongue was twitching at her lips. In seconds, she'd be gone, he knew. Once dead, she'd be beyond his power of recall. Is it... No, she said. She wasn't seeing him any longer. He opened his mouth to provide his answer, raising her neck to his bite. Her skin smelled sour. He bit deep into the muscle, her blood meaty on his tongue, the balm rising in his throat to enter her bloodstream. But the shudders in her body had already ceased. She slumped in his embrace. He raised his head from her torn neck, swallowing what he'd taken. He'd waited too long. Damn him. She was his mentor and his confessor, and he'd let her slip from him. Death had been upon her before he'd had time to turn sting into promise. Appalled at this last and most lamentable failure, he lay her down on the ground in front of him. As he drew his arms out from beneath her, she opened her eyes. I'll never leave you, she said. Chapter 25. Abide with Me. 1. It was Pettine who found Ashbury, but it was Eigerman who recognized the remnants for the man they'd been. The priest still had life in him, a fact, given the severity of his injuries, that verged on the miraculous. Both his legs were amputated in the days following, and one of his arms up to mid-biceps. He didn't emerge from his coma after the operations, nor did he die, though every surgeon opined that his chances were virtually zero. But the same fire that had maimed him had lent him an unnatural fortitude. Against all the odds, he endured. He was not alone through the nights and days of unconsciousness. Eigerman was at his side 20 hours out of every 24, waiting like a dog at a table for some scrap from above, certain that the priest could lead him to the evil that had undone both their lives. He got more than he bargained for. When Ashbury finally rose from the deep, after 2 months of teetering on extinction, he rose voluble, insane, but voluble. He named Baphomet. He named Cabal. He told in the hieroglyphs of the hopelessly lunatic of how the breed had taken the pieces of their divinity's body and hidden them. More than that, he said he could find them again. touched by the baptizer's fire and its survivor, he wanted the touch again. And smell God.
Is that better, buddy?
Over and over. Can you take us to him? Eigerman asked. The answer was always yes. I'll be your eyes then, Eigerman volunteered. We'll go together. Nobody else wanted the evidence Ashbury offered. There were too many nonsenses to be accounted for as it was, without adding to the burden on reality. The authorities gladly let Eigerman have custody of the priest. They deserved each other, was the common opinion. Not one sane cell between them. Ashbury was utterly dependent on Eigerman, incapable, at least at the beginning, of feeding, shitting, or washing without help. Repugnant as it was to tend the imbecile, Eigerman knew Ashbury was a God-given gift. Through him, he might yet revenge himself for the humiliations of Midian's last hours. Coded in Ashbury's randoms were clues to the enemy's whereabouts. With time, he'd decipher them. And when he did, oh, when he did, there would come such a day of reckoning the last trump would pale beside. 2. The visitors came by night, stealthily, and took refuge wherever they could find it. Some revisited haunts their forebears had favored, towns under wide skies where believers still sang on Sunday, and the picket fences were painted every spring. Others took to the cities, to Toronto, Washington, Chicago, hoping to avoid detection better where the streets were fullest, and yesterday's corruption, today's commerce. In such a place, their presence might not be noticed for a year, or 2, or 3, but not forever. Whether they'd taken refuge in City Canyon, or Bayou, or Dust Bowl, none pretended this was a permanent residence. They would be discovered in time and rooted out. There was a new frenzy abroad, particularly among their old enemies, the Christians, who were a daily spectacle, talking of their martyr and calling for purges in his name. The moment they discovered the greed in their midst, the persecutions would begin again. So discretion was the byword. They would take meat only when the hunger became crippling, and only then victims who were unlikely to be missed. They would refrain from infecting others, so as not to advertise their presence. If one was found, no other would risk exposure by going to his aid. Hard laws to live by, but not as hard as the consequences of breaking them. The rest was patience, and they were well used to that. Their liberator would come eventually, if they could only survive the wait. Few had any clue as to the shape he'd come in, but all knew his name. Cabal, he was called, who unmade Midian. Their prayers were full of him. On the next wind, let him come. If not now, then tomorrow. They might not have prayed so passionately had they known what a sea change his coming would bring. They might not have prayed at all had they known they prayed to themselves. But these were revelations for a later day. For now, they had simpler concerns. Keeping the children from the roofs at night, the bereaved from crying out too loud, the young in summer from falling in love with the human. It was the life.
This has been Cabal, written by Clive Barker, narrated by Chet Williams. Copyright 1995 by Clive Barker, Inc. This is one. Crossroad Press presents. Elias's face sagged too. His eyes seemed to peer inward, far away. Then it was gone, as quickly as it had come. It had only lasted a heartbeat. That was enough. Perrin shook himself and filled his lungs deeply. Elias did not pause. As soon as the veil lifted from his eyes, he sped toward the fire without any hesitation. Perrin ran wordlessly behind him. "Douse the fire!" Elias called hoarsely to Egwene. He gestured urgently. He seemed to be trying to shout in a whisper. "Get it out!" She rose to her feet, staring at him uncertainly, then stepped closer to the fire, but slowly, clearly not understanding what was happening. Elias pushed roughly past her and snatched up the tea kettle, cursing when it burned him. Juggling the hot pot, he upended it over the fire just the same. A step behind him, Perrin arrived in time to start kicking dirt over the hissing coals as the last of the tea splashed into the fire, hissing and rising in tendrils of steam. He did not stop until the last vestige of the fire was buried. Elias tossed the kettle to Perrin, who immediately let it fall with a choked-off yell. Perrin blew on his hands, frowning at Elias, but the fur-clad man was too busy giving our campsite a hasty look to pay any attention. "No chance to hide that somebody's been here," Elias said. "We'll just have to hurry and hope. Maybe they won't bother. Blood and ashes, but I was sure it was the ravens." Hurriedly, Perrin tossed the saddle on Bella, propping the axe against his thigh while he bent to tighten the girth. "What is it?" Egwene asked. Her voice shook. "Trunks? The babe?" "Go east or west," Elias told Perrin. "Find a place to hide, and I'll join you as soon as I can. If they see a wolf..." He darted away, crouching as if he intended to go to all fours, and vanished into the lengthening shadows of evening. Egwene hastily gathered her few belongings, but she still demanded an explanation from Perrin. Her voice was insistent and growing more frightened by the minute as he kept silent. He was frightened too, but fear made them move faster. He waited until they were headed toward the setting sun. Trotting ahead of Bella and holding the axe across his chest in both hands, he told what he knew over his shoulder in snatches while hunting for a place to go to ground and wait for Elias. "There are a lot of men coming, on horses. They came up behind the wolves, but the men didn't see them. They're heading toward the pool. Probably they don't have anything to do with us. It's the only water for miles. But Dapple says..." He glanced over his shoulder. The evening sun painted odd shadows on her face, shadows that hid her expression. What is she thinking? Is she looking at you as if she doesn't know you anymore? Does she know you? "Dapple says they smell wrong. It's sort of the way a rabid dog smells." The pool was lost to sight behind them. He could still pick out boulders, fragments of Archer Hawkwing's statue in the deepening twilight, but not to tell which was the stone where the fire had been. "We'll stay away from them. Find a place to wait for Elias." "Why should they bother us?" she demanded. "We're supposed to be safe here. It's supposed to be safe. Like there has to be some place safe." Perrin began looking harder for somewhere to hide. They could not be very far from the pool, but the twilight was thickening. Soon it would be too dark to travel. Faint light still bathed the crests. From the hollows between, where there was barely enough to see, it seemed bright by contrast. Off to the left, a dark shape stood sharp against the sky, a large flat stone slanting out of a hillside, cloaking the slope beneath in darkness. "This way," he said. He trotted toward the hill, glancing over his shoulder for any sign of the men who were coming. There was nothing. Yet. More than once he had to stop and wait while the others stumbled after him. Egwene was crouched over Bella's neck, and the mare was picking her way carefully over the uneven ground. Perrin thought they both must be more tired than he had believed. "This had better be a good hiding place. I don't think we can hunt for another." At the base of the hill, he studied the massive flat rock outlined against the sky, jutting out the slope, almost at the crest. There was an odd familiarity to the way the top of the huge slab seemed to form irregular steps, 3 up and 1 down. He climbed the short distance and felt across the stone, walking along it. Despite the weathering of centuries, he could still feel 4 joined columns. He glanced up at the step-like top of the stone, towering over his head like a huge lean-to. Fingers. Will shelter in Arthur Hawkwing's hand. Maybe some of his justice is left here. He motioned for Egwene to join him. She did not move, so he slid back down to the base of the hill and told her what he had found. Egwene peered up the hill with her head pushed forward. "How can you see anything?" she asked. Perrin opened his mouth, then shut it. He licked his lips as he looked around, for the first time really aware of what he was seeing. The sun was down. All the way down now, and clouds hid the half-moon, but it still seemed like the deep purple fringes of twilight to him. "I felt the rock," he said finally. "That's what it has to be. They won't be able to pick us out against the shadow of it, even if they come this far." He took Bella's bridle to lead her to the shelter of the hand. He could feel Egwene's eyes on his back. As he was helping her down from the saddle, the night broke out in shouts back toward the pool. She laid a hand on Perrin's arm, and he heard her unspoken question. "The men saw wind," he said reluctantly. It was difficult to make out the meaning of the wolves' thoughts. Something about fire. "They have torches." He pressed her down at the base of the fingers and crouched beside her. "They're breaking up into parties to search. So many of them, and the wolves are all hurt." He tried to make his voice heartier. "But Dapple and the others should be able to keep out of their way, even injured. And they don't expect us. People don't see what they don't expect. They'll give up soon enough and make camp." Elias was with the wolves and would not leave them while they were hunted. So many riders, so persistent. Why so persistent? He saw Egwene nod, but in the dark she did not realize it. "We'll be all right, Perrin." Light, he thought wonderingly. She's trying to comfort me. The shouts went on and on. Small knots of torches moved in the distance, flickering points of light in the darkness. "Perrin," Egwene said softly, "will you dance with me at Sunday? If we're home by then." His shoulders shook. He made no sound, and he did not know if he was laughing or crying. "I will. I promise." Against his will, his hands tightened on the axe, reminding him that he still held it. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I promise," he said again, and hoped. Groups of torch-carrying men now rode through the hills, bunches of 10 or 12. Perrin could not tell how many groups there were. Sometimes 3 or 4 were in sight at once, quartering back and forth. They continued to shout to one another, and sometimes there were screams in the night, the screams of horses, the screams of men. He saw it all from more than one vantage. He crouched on the hillside with Egwene, watching the torches move through the darkness like fireflies. And in his mind, he ran in the night with Dapple and Wind and Hopper. The wolves had been too hurt by the ravens to run far or fast, so they intended to drive the men out of the darkness, drive them to the shelter of their fires. Men always sought the safety of fires in the end when wolves roamed the night. Some of the mounted men led strings of horses without riders. They whinnied and reared with wide rolling eyes when the gray shapes darted among them, screaming and pulling their lead ropes from the hands of the men who held them. scattering in all directions as fast as they could run. Horses with men on their backs screamed too, when gray shadows flashed out of the dark with hamstringing fangs, and sometimes their riders screamed as well, just before jaws tore out their throats. Elias was out there also, more dimly sensed, stalking the night with his long knife, a two-legged wolf with one sharp steel tooth. The shouts became curses more often than not, but the searchers refused to give up. Abruptly, Perrin realized that the men with torches were following a pattern. Each time some of the parties came in view, one of them at least was closer to the hillside where he and Egwene were hiding. Elias had said to hide, but what if we run? Maybe we could hide in the dark if we keep moving. Maybe. It has to be dark enough for that. He turned to Egwene, but as he did, the decision was taken away from him. Bunched torches, a dozen of them, came around the base of the hill, wavering with the trot of the horses. Lance heads gleamed in the torchlight. He froze, holding his breath, hands tightening on his axe haft. The horsemen rode past the hill, but one of the men shouted, and the torches swung back. He thought desperately, seeking for a way to go. But as soon as they moved, they would be seen, if they had not already been. And once they were marked, they would have no chance, not even with the darkness to help. The horsemen drew up at the foot of the hill, each man holding a torch in one hand and a long lance in the other, guiding his horse by the pressure of his knees. By the light of the torches, Perrin could see the white cloaks of the Children of the Light. They held the torches high and leaned forward in their saddles, peering up at the deep shadows under Arthur Hawkwing's fingers. "There is something up there," one of them said. His voice was too loud, as if he was afraid of what lay outside the light of his torch. "I told you somebody could hide in that. Isn't that a horse?" Egwene laid a hand on Perrin's arm. Her eyes were big in the dark. Her silent question, plain despite the shadow hiding her features. What to do? Elias and the wolves still hunted through the night. The horses below shifted their feet nervously. If we run now, they'll chase us down. One of the white cloaks stepped his horse forward and shouted up the hill. "If you can understand human speech, come down and surrender. You will not be harmed if you walk in the light. If you don't surrender, you will all be killed. You have 1 minute." The lances lowered, long steel heads bright with torchlight. "Perrin," Egwene whispered, "we can't outrun them. If we don't give up, they'll kill us." "Perrin." Elias and the wolves were still free. Another distant, bubbling scream marked a white cloak who had hunted Dapple too closely. "If we run." Egwene was looking at him, waiting for him to tell her what to do. "If we run." He shook his head wearily and stood up like a man in a trance, stumbling down the hill toward the Children of the Light. He heard Egwene sigh and follow him, her feet dragging reluctantly. Why are the white cloaks so persistent, as if they hate wolves with a passion? Why do they smell wrong? He almost thought he could smell the wrongness himself when the wind gusted from the riders. "Drop that axe," the leader barked. Perrin stumbled toward him, wrinkling his nose to get rid of the smell he thought he smelled. "Drop it, bumpkin!" The leader's lance shifted toward Perrin's chest. For a moment he stared at the lance head, enough sharp steel to go completely through him. And abruptly he shouted, "No!" It was not at the horseman he shouted. Out of the night, Hopper came, and Perrin was one with the wolf. Hopper, the cub who had watched the eagles soar and wanted so badly to fly through the sky as the eagles did. The cub who hopped and jumped and leaped and was a leap higher than any other wolf, and who never lost the cub's yearning to soar through the sky. Out of the night, Hopper came and left the ground in a leap, soaring like the eagles. The white cloaks had only a moment to begin cursing before Hopper's jaws closed in the throat of the man with his lance leveled at Perrin. The big wolf's momentum carried them both off the other side of the horse. Perrin felt the throat crush, tasted the blood. Hopper landed lightly, already apart from the man he had killed. Blood mattered his fur, his own blood and that of others. A gash down his face crossed the empty socket where his left eye had been. His good eye met Perrin's too for just an instant. Brother. He whirled to leap again, soar one last time. The lance pinned him to the earth. The second like the steel thrust through his ribs, driving into the ground under him. It neatly snapped at the shafts that held him. Seymour. And it killed Baron, and he screamed. A wordless scream that had something of a wolf's cry in it. Without thinking, he leaped forward, still screaming. All thought was gone. The horsemen had bunched too much to be able to use their lances. The axe was a feather in his hands. One huge wolf's teeth of steel. Something crashed into his head. As he fell, he did not know if it was Hopper or himself who died. Soared like eagles. Bumbling, Baron opened his eyes woozily. He could not remember why. Blinking against the light, he looked around. He was kneeling, watching him where he lay. In a square tent as big as a medium-sized on tall stands, one on each corner. Instead of answering, he stared at the gray-haired man seated in a lone chair in the tent. A dark-eyed, looked back at him, a face at odds in his mind with the white and gold tabard the man wore, and the burnished armor strapped over his pure white undercoat. It seemed face, bluff and dignified. Something about it fit the elegant austerity of the tent's furnishings. A table and a folding bed, a washstand with a plain white basin and pitcher, a single wooden chest inlaid in simple geometric patterns. Where there was wood, it was polished. The metal gleamed, but not too brightly, and nothing was showy. Everything in the tent had the look of craftsmanship, but only someone who had watched the work of craftsmanship, like Master Luhan or Master Adair, the cabinet maker, would see it. Frowning, the man stirred two small piles of objects on the table. The contents of his pockets in one of those piles, and his belt knife. The silver coin Moraine had given him toppled out, and the man pushed it back thoughtfully. Pursing his lips, he left the piles and lifted Perrin's axe from the table, emptying it. His attention came back to the Emmonsfielders. Perrin tried to get up. Sharp pain, stabbing along his arms and legs, turned the movement into a flop. For the first time, he realized that he was tied, hand and foot. His eyes went to Egwene. She shrugged ruefully and twisted so that he could see her back. Half a dozen lashings wrapped her wrists and ankles, the cords making ridges in her flesh. The rope ran between the bonds around ankles and wrists, short enough to stop her from straightening to more than a crouch when she got to her feet. Baron stared. That they were tied was shock enough, but they wore enough ropes to hold horses. What did they think we are? The gray-haired man watched them, curious and thoughtful, like Master Albert finding out a problem. He held the axe as if he had forgotten it. The tent flap shifted aside, and a tall man stepped into the tent. His face was long, with eyes so deeply set they seemed to look out from caves. There was no excess flesh on him, no fat at all. His skin was pulled tight over the muscle and bone beneath. Baron had a glimpse of night outside and campfires, and two white-cloaked guards at the entrance of the tent. Then the flap fell back into place. As soon as the newcomer was into the tent, he stopped, standing as rigid as an iron rod, staring straight ahead of him at the far wall of the tent. His plate and mail armor gleamed like silver against his snowy cloak and undercoat. "My Lord Captain!" His voice was as hard as his posture, and grating, but somehow flat, without expression. The gray-haired man made a casual gesture. "Be at your ease, child buyer. You have tallied our costs for this encounter." The tall man moved his feet apart, but other than that, Perrin did not see anything easy about his stance. 9 men dead, my Lord Captain, and 23 injured, 7 seriously. All can ride, though. 30 horses had to be put down. They were hamstrung. He emphasized that in his emotionless voice, as if what had happened to the horses were worse than the deaths and injuries to men. Many of the remounts are scattered. We may find some at daybreak, my Lord Captain, but with wolves to send them on their way, it will take days to gather them all. The men who were supposed to be watching them have been assigned to night guard until we reach Camelin. We do not have days, child Bayar, the gray-haired man said mildly. We ride at dawn. Nothing can change that. We must be in Camelin in time, yes? As you command, my lord captain. The gray-haired man glanced at Perrin and Egwene, then away again. And what have we to show for it, aside from these two younglings? Bayard drew a deep breath and hesitated. I have had the wolf that was with this lot skinned, my lord captain. The hide should make a fine rug for my lord captain's tent. Hopper. Not even realizing what he was doing, Perrin growled and struggled against his bonds. The ropes dug into his skin. His wrists became slippery with blood. But they did not give. For the first time, Bayard looked at the prisoners. His face was as expressionless as his voice, but a cruel light burned in his sunken eyes as surely as flames burned in Baalzaman's. Bayard hated them as if they were enemies of long years instead of people never seen before tonight. Perrin stared back defiantly. His mouth curled into a tight smile at the thought of his teeth meeting in the man's throat. Abruptly, his smile faded and he shook himself. My teeth. I'm a man, not a wolf. Light, there has to be an end to this. But he still met Bayard's glare, hate for hate. I do not care about wolf-hide rugs, child Bayard. The rebuke in the Lord Captain's voice was gentle, but Bayard's back snapped rigid again, his eyes locking to the wall of the tent. You were reporting on what we achieved this night, no? If we achieved anything. I would estimate the pack that attacked us at 50 beasts or more, my Lord Captain. Of that, we killed at least 20, perhaps 30. I do not consider it worth the risk of losing more horses to have the carcasses brought in tonight. In the morning, I will have them gathered and burned. Those that aren't dragged off in the dark. Besides these two, there were at least a dozen other men. I believe we disposed of 4 or 5. But it is unlikely we will find any bodies, given the Dark Friends' propensity for carrying away their dead to hide their losses. This seems to have been a coordinated ambush. But that raises the question of... Perrin's throat tightened as the gaunt man went on. Elias. Cautiously, reluctantly, he felt for Elias, for the wolves, and found nothing. It was as if he had never been able to feel a wolf's mind. Either they or they've abandoned you. He wanted to laugh, a bitter laugh. At last he had what he had been wishing for, but the price was high. The gray-haired man did laugh just then, a rich, wry chuckle that made a red spot bloom on each of Bayard's cheeks. So, child Bayard, it is your considered estimate that we were attacked in a planned ambush by upwards of 50 wolves, and better than half a score of Dark Friends. Yes? Perhaps when you've seen a few more actions. But my Lord Captain Bornholt, I would say 6 or 8 wolves, child Bayard, and perhaps no other humans than these 2. You have the true zeal, but no experience outside the cities. It is a different thing bringing the light when streets and houses are far distant. Wolves have a way of seeming more than they are in the night, and men also. 6 or 8 at most, I think. Bayard's flush deepened slowly. I also suspect they were here for the same reason we are. The only easy water for at least a day in any direction. A much simpler explanation than spies or traitors within the children. And the simplest explanation is usually the truest. You will learn with experience. Bayard's face went deathly white as the grandfatherly man spoke. By contrast, the 2 spots in his hollow cheeks deepened from red to purple. He cut his eyes toward the 2 prisoners for an instant. He hates us even more now, Perrin thought, for hearing this. But why did he hate us in the first place? What do you think of this? The Lord Captain said, holding up Perrin's axe. Bayard looked a question at his commander and waited for an answering nod before he broke his rigid stance to take the weapon. He hefted the axe and gave a surprised grunt, then whirled it in a tight arc above his head that barely missed the top of the tent. He handled it as surely as if he had been born with an axe in his hands. A look of grudging admiration flickered across his face, but by the time he lowered the axe, he was expressionless once more. Excellently balanced, my lord captain. Plainly made, but by a very good weaponsmith, perhaps even a master. His eyes burned darkly at the prisoners. Not a villager's weapon, my lord captain, nor a farmer's. No. The gray-haired man turned toward Perrin and Egwene with a weary, slightly chiding smile, a kindly grandfather who knew his grandchildren had been up to some mischief. My name is Geoffrey Bornhold, he told them. You are Perrin, I understand. But you, young woman, what is your name? Perrin glowered at him, but Egwene shook her head. Don't be silly, Perrin. I'm Egwene. Just Perrin and just Egwene, Bornhold murmured. But I suppose if you truly are dark friends, you wish to hide your identities as much as possible. Perrin heaved himself up to his knees. He could rise no further because of the way he was bound. We aren't dark friends, he protested angrily. The words were not completely out of his mouth before Byar reached him. The man moved like a snake. He saw the handle of his own axe swinging toward him and tried to duck, but the thick haft caught him over the ear. Only the fact that he was moving away from the blow kept his skull from being split. Even so, lights flashed in his eyes. Breath left him as he struck the ground. His head wrung and blood ran down his cheek. You have no right, Egwene began, and screamed as the axe handle whipped toward her. She threw herself aside, and the blow whistled through empty air as she tumbled to the ground cloth. You will keep a civil tongue, Byar said, when speaking to an anointed of the light. Or you will have no tongue. The worst of it was, his voice still had no emotion at all. Cutting out their tongues would give him no pleasure and no regret. It was just something he would do. Go easy, child Byar. Bornhold looked at the captives again. I expect you do not know much about the Anointed, or about Lords Captain of the Children of the Light, do you? No, I thought not. Well, for child Byar's sake at least, try not to argue or shout, yes? I want no more than that you should walk in the light, and letting anger get the better of you won't help any of us. Perrin looked up at the gaunt-faced man standing over them. For child Byar's sake? He noticed that the Lord Captain did not tell Byar to leave them alone. Byar met his eyes and smiled. The smile touched only his mouth, but the skin of his face drew tighter until it looked like a skull. Perrin shivered. I have heard of this thing of men running with wolves, Bornhold said musingly, though I have not seen it before. Men supposedly talking with wolves and with other creatures of the Dark One. A filthy business. It makes me fear the last battle is indeed coming soon. Wolves aren't... Perrin cut off as Byar's boot drew back. Taking a deep breath, he went on in a milder tone. Byar lowered his foot with a disappointed grimace. Wolves aren't creatures of the Dark One. They hate the Dark One. At least they hate Trollocs and Fades. He was surprised to see the gaunt-faced man nod as if to himself. Bornhold raised an eyebrow. Who told you that? A warder, Egwene said. She scrunched away from Byar's heated eyes. He said wolves hate Trollocs, and Trollocs are afraid of wolves. Perrin was glad she had not mentioned Elias. A warder, the gray-haired man sighed. A creature of the Tar-Valon witches. What else would that sort tell you when he is a dark friend himself, and a servant of dark friends? Do you not know Trollocs have wolves' muzzles and teeth, and wolves' fur? Perrin blinked, trying to clear his head. His brain still felt like jelly pain, but there was something wrong here. He could not get his thoughts straight enough to puzzle it out. Not all of them, Egwene muttered. Perrin gave Byar a wary look, but the gaunt man only watched her. Some of them have horns, like rams or goats, or hawk's beaks, or all sorts of things. Bornhold shook his head sadly. I give you every chance, and you dig yourself deeper with every word. He held up one finger. You run with wolves, creatures of the Dark One. A second finger. You admit to being acquainted with a warder, another creature of the Dark One. I doubt he would have told you what he did if it was only in passing. The third finger. You, boy, carry a Tarvalin mark in your pocket. Most men outside Tarvalin get rid of those as fast as they can. Unless they serve the Tarvalin witches. A fourth. You carry a fighting man's weapon while you dress like a farm boy. A skulker, then. The thumb rose. You know Trollocs and Murdral. This far south, only a few scholars and those who have traveled in the borderlands believe they are anything but stories. Perhaps you have been to the borderlands? If so, tell me where. I have traveled a good deal in the borderlands. I know them well. No? Ah, well then. He looked at his spread hand, then dropped it hard on the table. The grandfatherly expression said the grandchildren had been up to some very serious mischief indeed. Why do you not tell me the truth of how you came to be running in the night with wolves? Egwene opened her mouth, but Perrin saw the stubborn set of her jaw and knew right away she was going to tell one of the stories they had worked out. That would not do. Not now, not here. His head ached, and he wished he had time to think it out, but there was no time. Who could tell where this Bornhold had traveled, with what lands and cities he was familiar? If he caught them in a lie, there would be no going back to the truth. Bornhold would be convinced they were dark friends then. We're from the Two Rivers, he said quickly. Egwene stared at him openly before she caught herself, but he pressed on with the truth, or a version of it. The two of them had left the Two Rivers to see Caemlyn. On the way, they had heard of the ruins of a great city. But when they found Shadar Logoth, there were Trollocs there. The two of them managed to escape across the river Arenel, but by that time they were completely lost. They fell in with a man who offered to guide them to Caemlyn. He said his name was none of their business, and he hardly seemed friendly, but they needed a guide. The first either of them had seen of wolves had been after the Children of the Light appeared. All they had been trying to do was hide so they would not get eaten by wolves or killed by the men on horses. If we'd known you were Children of the Light, he finished, we'd have gone to you for help. Bayar snorted with disbelief. Perrin did not care over much. If the Lord Captain was convinced, Bayar could not harm them. It was plain that Bayar would stop breathing if Lord Captain Bornhold told him to. There is no water in that, the gray-haired man said after a moment. Perrin's invention failed him. He knew he should have taken time to think it out. Egwene leaped into the breach. We met him in Baerlon. The city was crowded with men who had come down from the mines after the winter, and we were put at the same table in an inn. We only talked to him for the length of a meal. Perrin breathed again. Thank you, Egwene. Give them back their belongings, child Bayar. Not the weapons, of course. When Bayar looked at him in surprise, Bornhold added, Or are you one of those who would have taken to looting the unenlightened child Bayar? It is a bad business, that, yes? No man can be a thief and walk in the light. Bayar seemed to struggle with disbelief at the suggestion. Then you're letting us go? Egwene sounded surprised. Perrin lifted his head to stare at the Lord Captain. Of course not, child, Bornhold said sadly. You may be telling the truth about being from the Two Rivers, since you know about Baerlon and the mines. But Shadar Logoth, that is a name very few know. Most of them dark friends. And anyone who knows enough to know the name knows enough not to go there. I suggest you think of a better story on the journey to Amador. You will have time, since we must pause in Caemlyn. Preferably the truth, child. There is freedom in truth and the light. Bayar forgot some of his diffidence toward the gray-haired man. He spun from the prisoners, and there was an outraged snap to his words. You can't! It is not allowed! Bornhold raised one eyebrow quizzically, and Bayar pulled himself up short, swallowing. Forgive me, my Lord Captain. I forgot myself, and I humbly beg pardon and submit myself for penance. But as my Lord Captain himself has pointed out, we must reach Caemlyn in time, and with most of our remounts gone, we will be hard-pressed enough without carrying prisoners along. And what would you suggest? Bornhold asked calmly. The penalty for dark friends is death. The flat voice made it all the more jarring. He might have been suggesting stepping on a bug. There is no truce with the shadow. There is no mercy for dark friends. Zeal is to be applauded, child Bayar, but, as I must often tell my son Dane, overzealousness can be a grievous fault. Remember that the tenets also say, no man is so lost that he cannot be brought to the light. These two are young. They cannot yet be deep in the shadow. They can yet be led to the light, if they will only allow the shadow to be lifted from their eyes. We must give them that chance. For a moment, Perrin almost felt affection for the grandfatherly man who stood between them and Bayar. Then Bornhold turned his grandfather's smile on Egwene. If you refuse to come to the light by the time we reach Amador, I will be forced to turn you over to the questioners. And beside them, Bayar's zeal is but a candle beside the sun. The gray-haired man sounded like a man who regretted what he must do, but who had no intention of ever doing anything but his duty as he saw it. Repent, renounce the Dark One, come to the light, confess your sins and tell what you know of this vileness with wolves, and you will be spared that. You will walk free in the light. His gaze centered on Perrin, and he sighed sadly. Ice filled Perrin's spine. But you, just Perrin from the Two Rivers, you killed two of the children. He touched the axe that Bayar still held. For you, I fear a gibbet waits in Amador. Chapter 31. Play for your supper. Rand narrowed his eyes, watching the dust tail that rose ahead, 3 or 4 bends of the road away. Matt was already headed toward the wild hedgerow alongside the roadway. Its evergreen leaves and densely intermeshed branches would hide them as well as a stone wall, if they could find a way through to the other side. The other side of the road was marked by the sparse brown skeletons of head-high bushes, and beyond was an open field for half a mile to the woods. It might have been part of a farm not too long abandoned, but it offered no quick hiding place. He tried to judge the speed of the dust tail and the wind. A sudden gust swirled road dust up around him, obscuring everything. He blinked and adjusted the plain, dark scarf around his nose and mouth. None too clean now. It made his face itch, but it kept him from inhaling dust with every breath. A farmer had given it to him, a long-faced man with grooves in his cheeks from worry. I don't know what you're running from, he had said with an anxious frown. And I don't want to, you understand? My family. Abruptly, the farmer had dug 2 long scarves out of his coat pocket and pushed the tangle of wool at them. It's not much, but here. Belong to my boys. They have others. You don't know me, understand? It's hard times. Rand treasured the scarf. The list of kindnesses he had made in his mind in the days since Whitebridge.
All right, everyone. I'm going to call into this live for tonight.
Matt.
But I want to thank everyone for stopping by. Everyone keeps stopping by. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.